Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Curitin, and it's my delight tonight to welcome you to what is the last in our series of webinars titled Big Ideas, Concepts for the 250th. Now, tonight's topic is another big question that all of us think about and wrestle with in public history, and that is, how and why should we engage the public? We have a terrific panel put together for you tonight to tackle that big idea and that big question. And I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, just as you are. I want to end my brief welcome with a few thank yous, particularly to Mark Lawrence, who is our program coordinator at the Historical Commission. He's done a great job of shepherding this series of Big Ideas webinars. And also to Chris Myers, who did a terrific job in assisting Mark in compiling all of our great speakers in this series. And then finally, I want to thank Greer Luce, our Chief Communications Officer. She's done so much to help all of our programs at the Commission. And right now, she's going to get us started on tonight's panel. Greer?
Thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for our final Big Ideas Concepts for the 250th session, entitled How and Why Should We Engage the Public? I'm pleased to offer remarks tonight on behalf of Dr. Mark Lawrence, the Historical Commission's program coordinator, who is unfortunately not able to be with us tonight. So these are his remarks that I'm reading this evening. If you have joined us since the beginning of this series, you may have noticed a common thread that weaved its way throughout. How do we, as the public, with the similarities and differences that constitute a whole, meet the moment of commemorating the 250th anniversary of the formal founding of the United States of America? What fundamental questions do we have to ask ourselves in the present as we grapple with the complicated legacy of the past 250 years? What does this mean for those of us on the ground as we work towards achieving the ideals stated in the Declaration of Independence? These central questions undergird the impetus behind this series. Our first session, What is the American Revolution?, grappled with the complicated mythos of the American Revolution. Our panel, What is Identity and Why Does It Matter?, investigated the ways in which one's lived experience is shaped by shifting concepts of identity. Our discussion, How Does Society Shape Individual Actions and Beliefs?, explored the complicated relationship between systemic structures and the way they impact individual lives. Our How Do You Know What We Know dialogue dove into the complicated nature of the archive and how we infer information from historical sources. And now today, we finally arrive at the capstone session that brings it all together. How and why should we engage the public? The Big Ideas series lifts a mirror to our own biases and perspectives, asking us to interrogate why we do what we do, believe what we believe, and what is ultimately at stake in all of this. Over the last 20 years, a shift towards more meaningful public engagement in the social sciences and humanities has occurred. By embracing the methodological toolkits and theoretical perspectives undergirding approaches such as participatory research and placemaking initiatives, public practitioners have grappled with the nature of community and collaboration, exploring what it means to share power, co-design projects, and bring diverse voices and perspectives to the table. As the history community seeks to better engage the public and instill the importance of historical thinking, the call to meet communities where they are by telling stories and providing experiences and services that resonate with them is paramount. This shift requires moving beyond comfortable narrative spaces and practices that typically accompany historic sites and visitor experiences. In doing so, we ask folks to embrace their own imaginations, working with the creative energy and momentum that comes from letting go of power and control to create truly public spaces. Today, you will hear from panelists who specialize in this type of work, pushing you to think outside of the box, asking you to challenge expectations of what is possible as a historic site or organization. As with all of our Big Ideas panels, I hope you will listen with an open heart and mind, exploring the ways in which you can grapple with these very questions and ideas in your own work. I would now like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Varissa McMickens Blair. Varissa is a seasoned nonprofit and arts education professional with nearly 30 years of experience. She has led successful programming and volunteer efforts in urban, suburban, and rural communities across the nation. Varissa has been instrumental in growing organizations, hiring and training teaching artists and teachers, and developing and designing new programs wherever she has worked. McMickens Blair is founder and executive consultant of NOWWellspring Consulting, a boutique firm providing a variety of organizational and business services, including grant writing, strategic planning, interim and surrogate executive leadership, social media content management, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion planning, program and project management, and a host of other professional offerings. Varissa is the immediate past executive director of the Roebling Museum, a small up-and-coming history, heritage, and STEAM museum in New Jersey. In her role there, she was responsible for daily operations, expanding and developing programs, hiring and managing staff, overseeing the growth of the museum's volunteer corps, and increasing the museum's visitorship, social media, and online presence. Varissa also served as director of Greater Philadelphia's Arts Rising Initiative, a collaborative effort led by Philadelphia Education Fund, Fleischer Art Memorial, and Public Citizens for Children and Youth. She also worked as executive director of the DC Arts and Humanities Education Collaborative in Washington, DC, and developed regional replication program sites across the nation as assistant director of the Wolf Trap Institute for Early Learning through the Arts. McMickens Blair excels at community engagement, having used her unique combination of skills to reach thousands of youths, educators, parents, schools, organizations, businesses, and communities across the country. Her work is centered not only on advancing the creative impact and vision of her collaborators and clients, but also on increasing and nurturing the diversity of organizations and collaborators in order to ignite and catalyze their work and hers. So without further ado, I'd love to pass things over to Varissa.
Thank you so much, Greer. I really appreciate that introduction, and I'm excited for tonight's conversation. Welcome to everyone who has signed on, and welcome to all who will view this later. This is an engaging opportunity, and I'm glad to introduce the two folks who will be serving as our panelists tonight. I'll start by introducing Ms. Meredith Horsford. She's the executive director of Dyckman Farmhouse Museum and president of Greater Hudson Heritage Network. Meredith is serving as the executive director there at Dyckman Farmhouse Museum Association, and she's been there since 2015, where she leads her team toward creative and inclusive programming and interpretation with a community-focused perspective. In 2019, she spearheaded an extensive research project on the enslaved and free Black men and women that were instrumental in the prosperity of the Dyckman farm. And her goal at the museum is to connect the past with the present through programs such as a reoccurring race lecture series, contemporary art installations highlighting the Black experience in America, and urban agricultural programs. Horsford also has worked as a museum and nonprofit professional for the last 16 years, and she worked previously. Her work was, as the executive director of Gracie Mansion Conservancy, the official mayoral residence. And prior to that, she was deputy director of the Historic House Trust of New York City. She holds a master's of arts in geography from the University of Delaware, a Bachelor of Arts in Geography from the State University of New York College at Geneseo, and a certificate in grant making and foundations from New York University. Meredith Horsford is also the president of the board of directors for the Greater Hudson Heritage Network. So welcome, welcome, Meredith. So glad to have you here. I'm also going to introduce our additional panelist, and that is Michelle Moon. Michelle Moon is with Saltworks Interpretive Services. Michelle is a creative museum professional and independent consultant with 2 decades of experience in institutions and art, culture, and history, including positions as Chief Program Officer at the Tenement Museum, Director of Interpretation and Evaluation at the Newark Museum of Art, and Director of Education at Strawberry Bank Museum, and a Program Manager at Mystic Seaport Museum. As an interpretive specialist, she has contributed to more than 20 major exhibitions of art, history, and culture. A leader in museum education, she has extensive experience in audience development, program strategy, and program design for a wide range of audiences. Michelle's work has been focused on aligning museum value with the wants and needs of contemporary users through innovative, human-centered practice. She frequently writes and presents on making connections to people through culture, sense of place, and food history. And she's published 2 books on the intersections of public history and food movement. The missing, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go back and say this because there's a lot in here. She's frequently writes and presents on making connections to people through culture, sense of place, and food history, and has published 2 books on the intersections of public history and food studies, Interpreting Food at Museums and Historic Sites, Public History, and the Food Movement, The Missing Ingredient, co-authored by Kathy Stanton. A principal of Saltworks Interpretive Consulting, she works with cultural organizations nationwide on exhibition development, interpretive planning, and audience strategy. And she's an alumna of the History Leadership Institute Seminar for Historical Administration and holds a master's in museum studies from Harvard University's Extension School and a bachelor's of English and education from Connecticut College. So we have some amazing speakers, panelists. Welcome, and I want to give each of you a chance to say hello to our listeners, our audience tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Varissa mentioned, my name is Meredith Horsford. I run the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, which is located in Upper Manhattan. And I'll give it to Michelle so that we can get this party started.
Yeah, we'll keep it quick. I'm so thrilled everyone has joined us to talk about programming and the big ideas we have the opportunity to interpret through our programs in this 250th commemoration. So let's roll.
All right, let's roll. So we've had some conversations about this before today. We've been sort of thinking and working on this, all of us. And so I want to start with having each of you comment on the traditional approaches to historic sites. What do historic sites typically do when it comes to public engagement? And where is the field moving to? And why do you think we're moving in those directions?
I'll start us off if you don't mind.
Yeah, please, Meredith, go ahead.
I feel like a lot of historic sites have kind of had the "if we build it, they will come" mentality. That we're going to create this stuff to show you. We know that it's something that we're interested in. I don't know if it's something that the public is interested in, but we're going to create something and just hope people show up to see it. And I think that that's been very much the traditional model, especially at historic house museums. And I think that where the field is really heading is really, to me, a more honest, comprehensive history that doesn't leave all those holes, that really tells it kind of like it is. And I think also is something that will engage a much wider audience. It's not just, you're not just getting kind of the low hanging fruit of like the people who like architecture, the people who like history. there are probably many people who don't really realize that they love those things. And so if you can engage them in another way, they might realize that they're a lover of history.
Excellent, excellent. What do you think about those questions, Michelle? How about you?
Everything Meredith said, and I think I'm just old enough to remember being a kid during the bicentennial, and there was a sense then of both a looking backward and kind of taking stock of where the nation had come, and a lot of nostalgia with a patriotic flair, patriotic fervor. And I think where we are right now is different in that sense that we're not commemorating in such a purely celebratory sense. What we're doing is really asking deeper questions today about what the revolution meant, what it meant for whom, since there were so many different experiences of this dramatic time period of upheaval and change, and how we can find those avenues that Meredith mentioned to engage people who really might not know much about it. I think the tendency I know that I've had and many other history practitioners have had is to think, well, American Revolution, of course, everyone learns that in school. And of course, we all know the basic facts. But in fact, we know much more now than we used to. We have done so much new research in recent decades. Primary sources are emerging. New voices are coming into the picture. Our picture is shifting. And it's time to revisit that with a really fresh approach, and an approach that can engage people no matter their interest through big ideas and big themes.
So I think you're leading right into my next question. I really want to know from there, right, from where we think we're headed, from where you both have talked about in terms of, where we were, the looking back versus, sort of the deeper history that's sort of been dug into over the course of time. How do we then engage more people? What's the approach to partnering with others, to bringing new people in? What are some of the steps that folks can take to just bring and invite more people into the history that we're all sharing?
I think that from my perspective, this is something that I've given a lot of thought to when I started working at Dyckman. No one knew that we existed as a museum. People thought that I lived in this old house. So there was a lot of communication and miscommunication that needed, a lot of minds that needed to be changed there. So for me, from my perspective, I say cast a really wide net. I think that you never know who in your community will be your biggest ally, your greatest partner. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just the cultural organizations, although of course those are easy partners. I think that really thinking about who are the movers and shakers in your community, getting together with elected officials, and of course, thinking about those cultural organizations, but also thinking about who are the local businesses that really have their finger on the pulse of the community. In my neighborhood, everybody of every cultural background goes to the library. So who are those, what are those organizations, and who are those just general people that know everyone, and that, might help you meet a portion of your community that you don't already know, might be a great partner for programming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Michelle?
I would add to that list that, keeping that big wide map and taking stock of every possible organization in your community and thinking about what you have to offer. I'm assuming if someone is coming from a historic site or a museum or a library collection and you're looking for ways to engage the public, you can be thinking very specifically about what kinds of objects you have, what kinds of narratives you have, and come at that from the widest perspective. Who might be interested in the big themes around this? Because it might be that it's not the obvious players, as Meredith mentioned. It might be that it's the food bank. It might be that it's the county park system. It could be that you will find your allies where you may not expect. So I would agree, keep that very wide scope. pick up the phone, write that email, do some cold call invitations, walk in the business and say, hello, I'm working on a project. I wonder if you'd have any interest. I think this is on us to get out into the communities that we want to serve and not just sit and wait for people to come to us with their interest already fired up. We've got to help them understand what we might have to put at their service in an interesting way, in a new way. So we've been talking about programs that involve bike tours, or involve dinners in restaurants or taverns, or involve hikes, or kids events. You know, there are all sorts of ways to connect with your community that are not just about waiting for the history buffs to ring the doorbell.
Yeah. So I know that there's someone out there thinking this question: what does that have to do with history? Right? Because that's one of the barriers. There are some barriers that I really want us to address specifically as we go forward, and that's one of them. So how do you address that question when someone says, yeah, but what's that got to do with history?
Well, I think if history is what you do, right? If you're working at a historic site, I think everything that you do has to do with history. But if just because you have the great information doesn't mean that it's being dispersed out there into the community. And so if you don't make those phone calls or stop in the local business, just as Michelle is talking about, then you're holding on to the history and no one else knows about it. So I think in order to disseminate that information, in order to get people engaged and enthusiastic, and, you know, to bring those school groups in and to bring those senior groups in and to just, you know, get people in your community enthusiastic about it, you have to reach out so that you can talk about the history and do all the cool history programs.
Yeah. Michelle, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, because we want to be leveraging the resources we have in our history organizations. And if we get very far from that, we might as well be any sort of kind of recreational organization. So I always think what we want to do is be sure that what we're doing is grounded in evidence. That's one of the key tenets of the history profession. What is our evidence we're working from? And that it's informed by scholarship. And it's important that's recent scholarship. So we're thinking about the perspectives that historians like those who spoke in this series have brought to us about ways of thinking around the revolution today. So what are they thinking? And once we have those two things, what I would love to ask people to do is broaden your idea of what we mean when we say history. It doesn't have to be just a reenactment. Doesn't have to be just a lecture. History is costume and fashion. It's food, it's parents and children, it's place and being in the outdoors and landscape. All of these things are venues and subject matter that does have a historical connection. It is grounded in evidence and scholarship. So as long as we're linking those two things, which I think is our special role in public history, then we are doing our work. But I would love for people to think very broadly that there are so many entry points into history. Every subject matter has a history, and we can find a lot of those things that are inherently interesting to people in the 250th story.
Yeah, so I think that because tonight we're having this conversation, not just about sort of how to engage, but what engagement actually is. What does it look like? So talk about some of the real nuts and bolts about what engagement looks like with the different organizations that you work with, Michelle, because I know you're working with organizations all across the country. What does it look like when people are really putting forth effort to engage?
That's a great question, and it's calling up lots of visions in my mind. People being active. So I think one thing is we're giving people an active and participatory role. So it's not just showing up and listening to a lecture, though that might be part of your programming and that has its place. But it's also a full range of experiential options. It might involve people learning to create something, learning to do something, stepping in the shoes of someone else, sitting in an atmosphere that is new to them, taking part in a debate, doing detective work, following a quest. Some of these things where people have activity, agency to make choices and have impacts. And I think also a sense of ownership. I feel like, you know people have really engaged when they're going home and they're continuing to think about the content, or they're sharing it with someone online or in real life. They are doing further research, finding more information, conducting genealogy, maybe conducting local history research, looking in the archives, so that they've been activated. I think when I think about a really successful celebration or commemoration rather for New Jersey, I think about a state full of people that's newly interested and engaged in these origin stories of our nationhood, and really furthering their own understanding with excitement in ways that are meaningful to them.
And Meredith, so I'm going to ask you the same question about what engagement looks like through the lens of how you've approached that over the last, 7 years running Dyckman, right? So
Sure.
talk a little bit about what it looks like to engage now versus what it looked like to engage previously.
Yeah, sure. So when I started 7 years ago, there was literally no relationship, as I mentioned, between the community and the museum, even though we're a block from the subway and pretty much everyone in the entire neighborhood walks by the museum multiple times a day. We're physically up on this embankment because they had kind of dug down Broadway to kind of flatten it out. So physically we're up on the embankment, a little imposing looking. Maybe people felt like this wasn't for me. We're also in a community that's 70% Spanish speaking, and there was no Spanish at the museum of any kind prior to when I arrived. There were also these like room barriers, these metal gates that made it so that you couldn't walk into the rooms. Everything about it just made it feel very unwelcoming, whether you were Spanish speaking or English speaking, or any other language. I think it felt very unwelcoming. The focus was really on decorative arts and architecture. And, I think that when people would knock on the door, the feeling was like, okay, you can come in, but, we're only letting like 5 people in right now because, otherwise it gets too crazy. So it felt very unwelcoming. And so to kind of slowly take all of that down, it took some time, but, we started out by really making sure that all of our communication was bilingual. And that when we hang up flyers for a program, it's not just on the English speaking side of the community. We go down to the bodegas and to the Dominican restaurants and to anybody else who wants to hang up our flyers and make sure they're evenly distributed throughout the community, not just at the hipster coffee shops. We've partnered with elected officials. We've partnered with the local food pantry. We give out information at the farmers market. So we really try to, we've also held a million different kinds of programs to see kind of what interests people and what kind of fits best with our mission. And we've also partnered with local artists because we know that we're in a community that has a ton of artists, and there's nowhere in the neighborhood for them to exhibit their work. They have to go somewhere else to do that. So that's what kind of engagement we've been focusing on for the last several years.
That's great. I think what you're talking about is engagement with people, right? That the focus is the people, not the stuff, things, right? And I think that's a major shift, right? For many in the history world, that we are so excited to have archives and shelves filled with books and objects that are amazing. But the idea of actually allowing people to engage with those objects in meaningful ways, it shifts the work to being about the people, right? The stories.
Right. And those objects are amazing, but I think there's also a difference between saying, this is a lovely chair that the general, your random average person off the street is going to look at and say, sure, it's pretty, versus let's talk about, where was the wood made? Who made this chair? Who used this chair? What was their relationship like? If you have those deeper conversations, people can get interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And can the research lead you there? Is that where are you going where the research leads you, where the data lead? I mean, how do you get to that place from where we were?
Yeah, so I think part of it is just thinking from a different perspective, and having a really welcoming approach to things. Like, yes, we want you to be here. This is why we're here for you, I think, to start. But yes, absolutely. The research, I think, definitely can guide you. And, we've been conducting research on, as you mentioned, on the free and enslaved Black people that lived and worked on the farm at the Dyckman Farm, as well as local nearby farms. And through that research, we've uncovered names of enslaved and free people. We've uncovered, small tidbits of information. It's a lot of hard work to find this information, because in our case, they didn't really keep any records of these people at all, because they didn't treat them like human beings. But finding any little tidbit of information, a runaway slave ad, or a description of a person or a name, all of that can be used in an interesting way to talk about this person and talk about their life, their skills, their responsibilities, their family. There's so many interesting ways to talk about this information that I think will really resonate with people, right? We all have jobs and lives and families and, et cetera. So I think there are interesting ways to connect the past with the present.
Excellent. So Michelle, I'm going to ask you a question again, because I know you have the perspective from working in New Jersey, but you have this national perspective as well with the work that you've been doing. Let's talk about that engagement when it comes to the who, right? We had this wonderful conversation a while ago about this, and I think it's really important to the idea of shifting how we engage. So talk about the who and what's important about determining the who.
I think Meredith was really describing in what she just said, the way of finding universal human themes in these objects so that they aren't static and held off on a shelf as an object to be admired or impressed by, but to bring out those human stories that mean something to just about everyone. So finding those universal themes is a key, because they can connect with such a wide variety of audiences. But what I really recommend that when I work with clients at historic sites, I will often hear something like, well, we want our exhibit to be for a general audience. We want the general public to come. And what I like to say is that there is really no general audience, because there's no general human. We're all specific people. We come from specific families, specific histories, specific identities, and we have differences, and those differences make us interesting. So we want to be thinking very specifically about who we are crafting experiences for. As Meredith described, in knowing that a large part of the potential audience is Spanish speaking, helped them to craft outreach that really spoke to those audiences, and it made them feel invited in. So understanding very specifically, who are you speaking to? Knowing, are you reaching out to teens and youth? Are you reaching out to seniors? Are you reaching out to teachers and students in class groups? Are you reaching out to recreational adult groups? All these things are very different, to churches, and getting a sense of that community, who they are, what they value. I also think that part of this really is specific to who we are in New Jersey. And as you heard from my bio, I traveled around a lot of years and came back home to New Jersey because of lots of love for it. And we are one of the most diverse states in the nation. And that's something we really need to honor and celebrate and recognize in our programming. All of our communities have richness, and we can find so many stories to tell and ways of connecting with people. And just, to throw some statistics out that I looked at right before our call, 1 out of 4 New Jerseyans is an immigrant in their own lifetimes. 1 out of 6 comes from a household and family where one of the parents, at least one, is an immigrant. 1 out of 4 households speaks a language other than English, and there are 150 some languages spoken in the state. We have a racially diverse population. We have a religiously and ethnically diverse population. And all of this was true in revolutionary times as well. And it still impacts our ongoing discussion about who we are as a nation, how we express our voices, how we access our rights, how we make decisions about who, justice and freedom. So I think that knowing very specifically who your audience is and aiming beyond that existing audience you might have or the history identified audience is really, really important. So getting to know your community, and then finding those big themes that speak to our humanity, whoever we are, wherever we come from, is a key to project success.
Yeah, I think that, what you're touching on, of course, is that diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion lens that we see, framing so much of what's moving organizations forward in good and positive ways. That there tends to be homogeneous audiences, right, along many lines, along racial lines, gender lines, along socioeconomic lines, so many, areas and spaces and places where I think there is a need to diversify audiences. So, when we're talking about engagement, right, of these variety of audiences, you've both talked about some ways to do that. So I think that that's one of the things we want to be a big takeaway tonight. That there's a way to reach into communities around you, so that the work that you're doing, that historical sites and organizations, teachers who are teaching history, can reflect the vast array of human experience through a history lens, right? It can connect with others beyond their existing audiences, right? And so maybe that's one of the things you can talk about. Both of you might want to just talk about the impact that maybe you've seen on your audiences at the organizations that you represent, when you begin to diversify the folks that you're reaching. Either one, Meredith. I'll say
Sure.
you go.
Okay, I got it. All right. I would say that our audience changed dramatically from, a few Dutch and German tourists, or a few people that saw us in a guidebook, a handful of people from the community, often people who would come and say, oh, I grew up in this neighborhood and I came back to visit and I wanted to come see the museum.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was our audience when I first started. And we never had anybody, or rarely had anybody, who was Spanish speaking. We rarely had anybody who said, I live down the street. And so I would say over time, and as you mentioned earlier, it did take quite some time. We have seen, we're tracking, zip codes of visitors, and we're really seeing that people are coming in and they live a few blocks away. And then we notice that they'll come back a few days later and bring a relative. And they're joining our mailing list, and then attending that lecture or attending that wine tasting. And so we've seen a massive shift from, serving almost none of the community to, maybe 70-75% of our audience being local community members, which has been amazing. And another thing that I'll mention is, we started to, talk about a topic that is a challenge for people to really swallow, to talk about slavery, to talk about the fact that we know that the Dyckmans owned slaves. And in doing so, we've had community members who have reached out and said, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I never visited the museum before. I didn't feel as though it had anything for me. And in recent years, I've been keeping up with your programming. I've seen you in the newspaper. I've attended a few events, and really feel like for the first time, this is, I'm proud to live in this community, to live across the street from this museum, to be a part of what you do. And now, we email all the time. These folks come to all of our programs. And so it's really, honestly, personally, very satisfying to see that shift, and for people to feel like, I'm welcome here. This is a place for me, and I'm engaged in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is an amazing museum story, and an incredible model that I hope will inspire lots of others, because I think this is the opportunity, is opening your doors and really connecting as that neighborhood resource with the people right around you. And many of our historic institutions in New Jersey are in a neighborhood, or they're pretty easy to access. So I would hope to see that trajectory continue. And I have various stories from various museums that are quite similar. thinking to my time at the Tenement Museum, for example, where the focus at that museum had for quite some time been on the European immigration from 1880 to 1920 or so. And during the years I was there, we began the museum's first major project to interpret African-American history in that neighborhood. And of course, after, we did a series of talks, we made our research public and did some public discussions to help advance the story. We partnered with local organizations that were focusing on Manhattan's Black history. And we saw an audience that had never attended that museum turning up, Black New Yorkers who were seeing very clearly that this story was now being represented. So there is a power to knowing that an organization is telling a story that connects to you. People do want to support that and will show their interest when that becomes evident to them. And when you do it in a trustworthy way and you do it in a consistent way and out of sincere desire to engage and maintain a relationship. So I think that's something to keep in mind as places begin to broaden their narratives, is that, the one talk or the one program, you may see members of a new community show up, but you want to really sustain that engagement and weave those narratives into your ongoing everyday interpretation, because these are all of our stories. They deserve to be represented. I see that happening in some of my Monmouth County park sites now there was an initiative begun to bring the story of enslavement into the foreground in many of these sites, and that has had an impact. And I would say our audiences want this. People are crying for understanding more honestly the full history of who we are in this nation, and they appreciate that honesty, authenticity, and evidence that we're able to bring. So I think I see in the Q&A, someone asked about how do you convince your board? And this is one piece of the puzzle, is show them the results in those, new community members that are showing up in Meredith's museum, the impact of taking on tougher topics in your programming and doing that with a sincere desire to engage. You'll see response, and that means more people are valuing your resource.
And just to add to that, I think also, if you try out the public program and notice that it's successful, like that's you can start to create these small moments of success that you can start to really build a case that, this is where the field is going, and this is something that our community really is looking for.
So we have a question in the chat. I'm going to circle back to a question. We don't have a lot of time left. It's gone really quickly, but I do want to give an opportunity for James's question to be asked. And he says, earlier this year, I was asked this question: how do you answer when a parent asks if you are teaching patriotism and the heroes of American history? What do we do? Right, because those are real questions coming up in the real time for history teachers and for historic organizations. So, any advice, any guidance from you?
I'll start on that one and then hand the baton. But James, I don't know if you're a teacher, but I want to just recognize all of our teachers on the call, that this is a really tough time to be a teacher. And we, as partners out here in the public history world, really recognize and appreciate that you are facing lots of questions and challenges and uncertainties about sharing history with your students. So thank you. And we want, as institutions, to have your back in whatever way we can. So just know that. But I think when I see these challenges come up, the move that I want to make is to turn the challenge into a question. So you've been asked, where are the heroes and the patriots? I think the question there is, what do we define as a national hero? And what do we mean by patriot? If there's a way in a classroom that you can open that question up and say, we've been asked, who are our heroes in the United States? And, maybe the folks asking are thinking about the George Washingtons or the, Rochambeau or whomever that they might feel are the primary characters. And it's a great question to ask, are they heroes? And in what way were they heroic? And what way were they human? And what way were they subject to the context of their times and the value systems and the privileges of their times? How can we look at them as full, complex human beings as they were? It doesn't take away the heroic things they did, but it also maybe opens up the opportunity to see heroism in other people who may not have had as much access to fame or resources, but who were heroically following their values and their commitments in history, trying to make those promises in the Constitution come true for their communities. So I don't know if that's too easy of an answer, but it's something I think I'd love to see us do more in the historical process. One of the goals of the 250th is do history, and that's about asking questions. What does heroism look like in American history?
Yeah.
I'll end there and hand that off.
Yeah, Meredith.
I love your answer. I'm glad you went first. I think that's a perfectly smart and kind of introspective way to think about that question. I mean, my gut reaction is, maybe just to say that, what we're talking about are the facts of what happened, the facts of what we have, and that it's not a, good versus bad, or a, good versus evil, or one side versus the other kind of thing, that it's more of, this is what we know to be what happened. And exactly, talk about the circumstances and they were coming from this location and fighting in this location and living under these circumstances. And I mean, there are a lot of complex things that you could really talk about there. And I don't think it's a, good versus bad kind of conversation necessarily.
I mean, I just circle back to thinking about what we were talking about earlier, the research, right? The more we understand about our historic sort of representatives and characters and individuals whom we all sort of have come up knowing about, the more people understand about them. I mean, we're living in the days of, social media everywhere, right? We can see people's lives, we think, instantaneously. We're constantly following people. Celebrities have, every moment of their lives documented, but that's not how many historical figures, the information is still emerging. Right. So as the ongoing research emerges, I believe that part of what we have to do is continue to present what the research bears out. And again, not as a good versus evil, bad, good, but as a, this is what the history is. History is. It isn't something we can, detract from or take away from or edit away. But it is something that we need to be sharing, and again, connecting the histories of lots of different people, and thinking about, I love the answer, Michelle, about thinking about who's a hero, right? Why are they a hero? What makes them a hero? What makes them human as well? So it's just, beautifully couched answers from both of you. I want to make sure that before we go, we can share some resources about, connecting with more diverse audiences. I think one of the things we've talked about in that is working to try to diversify boards of directors, reaching out to communities of color, communities with various languages, inviting folks from various socioeconomic, communities within one community to be a part of the work, reaching into education, reaching into different kinds of spaces. So maybe as we begin to wrap up, you can talk just a bit about the, how and where we engage, not necessarily on site, right? What happens if we take the history to the folks? What does that look like? What is that a reasonable expectation for historical organizations, history teachers, and others to do?
I think so. I think that, especially if we're still focusing on the collection, the architecture, and not really doing the outreach and expecting people to come. I think that by going out into the community, that's a great way to start that dialogue, start that relationship. We've done a lot of different things at the museum that, some work, some don't, some of it is trial and error, certainly. But we've done a lot of things where we try to do outreach into schools and do programs in the schools versus expecting the schools to come to us. Although in New York City, I will tell you that was a crash and burn, because we had to, everybody had to get fingerprinted, and there were all sorts of extensive things that we were never able to actually do it, but we tried. We, often give out information at the farmers market. We've partnered with local houses of worship in the community. That's a great place to meet all sorts of members of your community, which is fantastic. And I think also just really thinking about kind of meeting people where they are. I mean, and getting community buy-in. One of that first question that Michelle touched on in the chat was about, how do you get your board on board, and all of those really important questions. I think getting community buy-in is also really important, and that might help sway your board in that direction. For some of the projects that we've been working on, we'll hold just what we call a community conversation when we hold it at the library, where there's a place that people feel comfortable, that people are regularly frequenting. And we had people show up that we've never seen before, that we've never engaged with before. And we talked to them about enslavement. And, also, it wasn't like a cupcake, lighthearted conversation, but we've had conversations about the enslaved burial ground in our community that was on Dyckman property. We've had conversations about the 5 names that we uncovered. And, the feedback that we've gotten is so invaluable. Sometimes you get a comment that you're thinking, oh, right, of course, that's a great idea. We didn't think about that. Maybe we'll try to incorporate that into the museum. And so by engaging the community in that conversation, I think that it gets them much more invested in the organization and what you're doing. And I think that that's also great ammunition to bring to your board.
Yeah, I also just wanted to suggest for the person who's asked about how to diversify your audience. Sometimes it's different than you think. It could be the development of a program that's for moms and with young children, right? Where you also make sure that there's a designated changing space for moms that have babies that need to be changed if your space doesn't already have that. It could be doing programming that welcomes in LGBTQ+ community members around Pride Month, and actually just around their own history and how it might intertwine with the history that you're teaching. Maybe there are very specific stories of individuals connected to the history that you're sharing and interpreting. So those are different ways to do that. And maybe it's as, doing something as simply as what our friend Twyla has put in the chat. And I want to acknowledge that, Twyla. Thank you for acknowledging that you're on Lenape land. Maybe that's part of it too, right? Those kinds of things where we connect with the indigenous stories and histories that we all have that surround us, because they are there, right? Is there a burial ground? Is there a ceremonial space near where you are? Is there a larger community or a small community of folks from indigenous communities that are there? So there are lots of ways to think about how to connect. And I just want to thank both Michelle and Meredith for their time tonight and for their insights. I want to give both of you just a few moments to say anything that you'd like to say to sort of wrap up, especially as it relates to any advice to historic sites and educators as we approach the two. Let me just say, yeah. You're unmuted. Unmuted, Michelle.
Thanks, our new faux pas. I just want to thank everyone for attending, and I'm just a booster of all of those of us who care about uncovering and sharing our histories. It is so important to establishing our identity, our sense of place in the world, and our ability to recognize the truths of our history together. To me, that understanding of history is an important shared resource that we need to be able to go forward together and improve our world. So thanks to all of you for coming and doing the work. And I just want to encourage you to network, be bold, make that new relationship, go show up at other festivals and events that you don't normally go to, and just get out there and begin making friends, because I think that you'll find there's enthusiasm to partner with you. And you might have to work through 4 or 5 people who are too busy or not interested, but when you find that 1 or 2 who say, yes, we want to work with you and tell stories with you, you will be off and running. So just make some new friends.
Meredith.
Sure. I would just add, again, also, just as Michelle mentioned, thanks everyone so much for attending. It's really fun, I'm sure, for Michelle and for Varissa and I to kind of get up here and talk about what we do and what we're passionate about. So thank you for coming. I would say, for me, I think that what people most resonate with as they, think about going to a historic site, is kind of thinking about those common themes and common threads, and what does this have to do with my life? And, you know, you may think that your history at your site may not have something to do with, you know, your present day community's lives. But I think that if you really take a step back and think about it, there are probably a lot of intersections between the history and people's present day lives. And I find that that's what people most resonate with and what sticks with them. So I think just really thinking critically about what those things might be. And just as Michelle was saying, kind of get out there and talk to people and have those conversations. I think you get great feedback that I think will help you kind of steer you along the way.
Okay, thank you both so much. And I'll share just as we wrap up, my encouragement to each of you is to make history responsive, take it to the people. This right now is history's time to shine. History is in the spotlight every day right now. Folks are watching, folks are paying attention. This is our time, folks. Let's get out there and share history with everyone. History is for everyone. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you so much. I can't think of better words to end this conversation, and a better discussion to end our entire series. So thank you all so much. I hope everyone stays safe and well and has a wonderful evening. And we will be in touch with this panel recording, which will be shared publicly, and with information about exciting upcoming events as well. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for having us.